For generations, Canada and the United States shared a close partnership, open borders, integrated economies, and mutual trust. Our two nations built a relationship that was the envy of the world, rooted in shared values and a deep sense of cooperation. Families, businesses, and entire industries thrived on the predictability and goodwill that defined the border. But the America First doctrine shattered this assumption, recasting Canada as a competitor rather than a partner. Suddenly, the neighbor we had always counted on began to look inward, prioritizing its own interests above all else. Suddenly, friendly rhetoric gave way to confrontation, and the stability we relied on evaporated. Headlines blared about tariffs and trade wars, and the tone between leaders shifted from warmth to suspicion. Canadian policymakers, businesses, and citizens faced a jarring new reality. Our economic dependence on the US was a vulnerability, not a strength. The sense of security that had underpinned decades of prosperity was suddenly in question, leaving many to wonder how we could adapt. The 2018 G7 summit in Charlevoix made this rupture public, as personal attacks and the US withdrawal from the joint communiqué signaled the end of the special relationship. The world watched as the cracks in our alliance widened, and the trust that had taken generations to build was put to the test. For Canada, this was a wake-up call. Relying on history and friendship was no longer enough. We had to confront the uncomfortable truth that our future could not rest on old assumptions. The rules-based order we championed was being undermined by its own architect. The very system that had protected our interests was now being questioned and even dismantled. We had to rethink our economic and diplomatic strategies in a world where old certainties were gone. New alliances and markets needed to be explored, and our approach to global engagement had to evolve. The message was clear. Our greatest ally could also be our greatest source of instability. The challenge was daunting, but it was also a call to action for Canada to redefine its place in the world. Canada needed a new plan for a new era, one that would secure our future, diversify our partnerships, and ensure our resilience in an unpredictable world. The threat of protectionism became real when the US imposed steep tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, citing national security concerns. This sudden move sent shockwaves through the Canadian economy and raised alarms across industries that had long relied on open access to the American market. The tariffs disrupted decades of carefully integrated supply chains, threatening thousands of Canadian jobs and putting entire communities at risk. Factories that depended on cross-border trade faced uncertainty overnight, and workers worried about their futures. Canada responded with targeted tariffs of its own, aiming to pressure the US to reconsider. But the damage was already done, and confidence in the stability of the trading relationship was shaken. At the same time, NAFTA was thrown into a high-stakes renegotiation. The US used the threat of withdrawal as leverage, forcing Canada and Mexico to the bargaining table under intense pressure. The resulting USMCA preserved some key Canadian interests, but the process exposed just how vulnerable Canada was to shifts in US political winds. The experience was a wake-up call for policymakers and business leaders alike. Even after the New Deal was signed, the threat of further tariffs lingered. It became clear that stable, predictable access to the US market could no longer be taken for granted. Canadian businesses now faced a new era of volatility and risk, where old assumptions about trade security no longer held true. The experience forced Canada to accelerate efforts to diversify trade, seeking new partners and markets beyond North America to reduce its dependence on a single neighbor. The lesson was stark. Canada could not afford to be so exposed again. The risks of relying too heavily on one trading partner had become painfully clear. Building new economic bridges, especially with Europe and Asia, became urgent priorities for the country's future prosperity and security. The era of predictable, easy trade with the US was over, and Canada had to chart a new course in an uncertain world. The impact of US tariffs was immediate and severe for Canadian industry. In April 2025, manufacturing sales dropped by 2.8%, the sharpest decline in over a year. Wholesale sales fell, and Canada posted a record trade deficit, signaling deep trouble. Businesses, large and small, reported lost contracts, rising costs, and paralyzing uncertainty. Nearly half of manufacturers and wholesalers felt the pain directly. The ripple effects extended far beyond targeted sectors, stalling investment and job growth nationwide. The data was a wake-up call. Our economic growth was being eroded by trade friction with our largest partner. The message was clear. Canada's deep integration with the US had become a liability. Diversifying trade relationships was no longer optional. It was essential. The numbers told a story of economic injury that demanded a strategic response. Canada had to act, and fast. Confronted with US protectionism, Canada turned to Europe and the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA. CETA eliminated 98% of tariffs, opening a market of 450 million consumers to Canadian businesses. As US trade became riskier, the EU's stable, rules-based market grew more attractive. Canadian exports to the EU surged by over 20% since CETA's implementation. This wasn't just about traditional goods. Tech, manufacturing and services all found new opportunities. Every new European contract reduced our over-reliance on the US. CETA also deepened cooperation on green tech, critical minerals and digital trade. The EU became a partner eager to shape the global economy with us. The CETA Gambit worked. Canada proved it could build resilient partnerships beyond North America. Europe offered stability, predictability, and shared values. Our pivot east was a strategic success. The EU's resilience to US protectionism stood in stark contrast to the UK's struggles post-Brexit. While the EU's trade with the US held strong, the UK's exports plummeted, exposing its vulnerability. For Canada, this was a lesson in the power of a unified economic bloc. CETA's legally binding rules offered Canadian businesses the stability they craved. Unlike the volatile US relationship, the EU provided clear, durable frameworks for trade and investment. This predictability allowed companies to plan, invest, and grow with confidence. The EU emerged as an indispensable partner in an uncertain world. The contrast was clear. Strength lay in numbers and in rules, not in going it alone. Canada's deepening partnership with the EU was both logical and necessary. In a turbulent era, Europe became our anchor. The future demanded stability, and the EU delivered. G7 summits have become a stage for Canada's shifting alliances, reflecting not just diplomatic maneuvering, but also the evolving priorities of global power players. The 2018 Charlevoix summit exposed deep fractures, with the US publicly attacking Canada and withdrawing support from the joint communiqué. The world watched as tensions flared, signaling a dramatic shift in the tone of international cooperation. This shattered the illusion of Western unity and forced Canada to seek new allies, pushing it to reconsider its place within the traditional alliance structure. Europe emerged as a natural partner, sharing Canada's commitment to multilateralism and rules-based order. Both sides recognized the value of closer cooperation in an increasingly unpredictable world. By the 2025 G7 summit, the dynamic had changed. Open confrontation gave way to cautious diplomacy, as leaders sought to avoid the public drama of previous years. European leaders avoided public spats with the US, focusing instead on behind-the-scenes collaboration. Quiet negotiations replaced grandstanding, and new coalitions began to take shape. The Canada-EU partnership visibly deepened, with joint efforts on trade and global challenges. Their shared vision for the future became a cornerstone of G7 discussions. The G7 now highlights a new configuration, a more isolated US and a cohesive Canada-Europe axis, united by common interests and a desire for stability. These summits showcase Canada's strategic pivot to Europe for the world to see, making clear that the country is not just adapting but actively shaping its alliances. The message is unmistakable. Alliances are shifting and Canada is leading the way, setting an example for others navigating a changing world order. The G7 is no longer about easy consensus. It's about forging new paths, building bridges where old ones have crumbled, and finding common ground amid uncertainty. Canada and Europe are charting one together, determined to shape the future of global cooperation in their own image. US trade tensions have triggered a global realignment of supply chains, prioritizing resilience over efficiency. Companies are moving production out of China, seeking stable partners. For Canada, this shift is an opportunity. Our partnership with the EU positions us as a key player in secure transatlantic supply chains for critical goods. CETA enables seamless trade and investment between two stable democracies. Together, Canada and the EU offer an alternative to US or China-dominated supply chains. Canada's resources and reliability make us indispensable to Europe's industrial future. By strengthening our EU ties, we enhance our own security and global influence. The flux in global supply chains is our chance to lead. US trade disputes have reshaped Canadian public opinion and politics. Initial unity and support for retaliatory tariffs were strong. 80% backed them, even at higher costs. But as economic pain grew, support softened, dropping to 70% by mid-2025. Canadians began to question the limits of confrontation and the need for pragmatic solutions. This shift created a political challenge: appear strong, but avoid self-inflicted harm. The pivot to Europe became not just economic strategy, but political necessity. Growing EU trade allowed the government to show a proactive plan for prosperity. Canadians increasingly saw diversification as the path to security and stability. The public's journey mirrored the government's, from defiance to strategic adaptation. America first shattered the old Canada-US partnership, forcing Canada to confront its economic vulnerability. The shock of tariffs and trade disputes was painful, but it spurred a necessary pivot. Canada reached out to Europe, forging a new path with CETA at its core. The results: rising exports, deeper cooperation, and shared values validated this strategy. The Canada-EU partnership now stands as a powerful axis of open market democracies. We're building secure, resilient supply chains and offering an alternative to coercive models. This is about more than trade. It's about sovereignty and influence in a turbulent world. The US remains important, but it's no longer our only defining relationship. Canada's future is now linked with Europe, built on diverse global partnerships. The old map is gone. We're drawing a new one, together with Europe.